very backed up on the highway coming in, so we may see some stragglers. And I did not mean to call you a straggler, Senator Stefan, because it's still 8:30. It's 8:30 for this full minute. Good morning. Committee, we're going to begin with the hearing on HB 2262, and we'll start with a review from Jenna.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, members of the committee. Jenna Meyer, Office of Revisor Statutes. House Bill 2262 amends existing law in KSA 65-1701 and 65-1703 to allow an embalmer apprenticeship to be served in two 6-month periods. Current law requires that apprenticeship be served after the completion of the embalmer school, and current law requires it has to be all done in one 12-month period, and this would allow it to be split, to have 6 months before enrolling in a school of mortuary science and 6 months after graduating from the School of Mortuary Science. And it would also require personal supervision, direct personal supervision of the apprentice during that initial 6-month period. And I'll be happy to answer any questions about the bill.
Committee, any questions for Jenna? Seeing none, thank you, Jenna. We will move to our proponent testimony from Pam Scott, who's the Executive Director of the Kansas Funeral Directors Association. Pam, welcome to committee.
Good morning. We appreciate the opportunity to testify in support of 2262, which we did ask for the introduction of. It did pass the House, 121 and none opposed. Currently, to become an embalmer in Kansas, you have to complete 60 hours of college credit, including a 12-month course of study in mortuary science from an accredited mortuary science school. Kansas has one, Kansas City, Kansas Community College, that provides such a degree. You also have to pass a national board exam and then complete an apprenticeship under the supervision of a licensed embalmer, as stated. And we want to provide, Kansas, like other states, is having a difficulty in finding people to enter the profession. So we want to provide we try to make it easier for someone to become licensed. Other states, Nebraska, for instance, we're following Nebraska in offering this 6 months prior to, serving 6 months prior to mortuary science school and 6 months afterwards. And the purpose is to number one, to weed out people who enter the profession and then later find out it's not for them. And also, again, to shorten the length of time it takes for someone to become licensed. A lot of times people enter the profession, they have no practical experience in a funeral home. They may find it intriguing. They may be a very caring and empathetic person and want to help others. They may enjoy science, but they've never had the opportunity to work in a funeral home, much less embalm dead human bodies. So when they get in, they may discover they can't deal maybe with the death of a child. Those seem to be some of the more difficult cases for funeral directors and embalmers. They may have to reconstruct someone who has been killed in a horrific car accident, and they just, they find out this isn't something for me. I can't take this. So they get out of the profession only having spent a lot of money going to mortuary science school and also taking a year out of their lives to go to school. So this would shorten the length of time for someone. They could, while they're doing the first 6 months of the apprenticeship, they could complete their underlying college necessary to get into mortuary science school. The whole program's 60 hours, 30 of basic courses, and then 30, which is a 1-year course of mortuary science school. So they could shorten the time it takes to become an embalmer also. So those are really the two reasons we had a task force together kind of looking at some ways that we could make it easier. We kind of followed the Nebraska law. So We believe this will make it easier to attract embalmers and to get them licensed, so we'd appreciate your support.
Thank you. Questions for Pam this morning? Okay, Senator Baumgartner.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Pam, thank you for being here. I've appreciated your testimony in the past. So the schools, how are they with this? The
They're
schools
fine
that
with
often,
it.
they're
Yeah.
comfortable with it?
We let them know we were doing this along the way.
Okay, wonderful, thank you.
Pam, I would just like to say that as a former teacher, and I taught school in Lawrence and had lots of student teachers, and I often thought it would be nice if they would have had more experience in the classroom before going through all of their college and then deciding maybe being a teacher is not right for me. How sad. So I think this idea of allowing that time for them to be able to be in that apprenticeship sounds like a good idea. Committee, any other questions for Pam? Thank you, Pam. And committee, this concludes the hearing on HB 2262. We are now going to move on to a hearing of 2034. Jenna.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members of the committee, House Bill 2034 would require a referral of an alleged victim of child abuse or neglect to be examined as part of an investigation and would create a program to process and medically examine such children. We're going to start in Section 2, since it defines the terms. Section 2 amends KSA 3820-202 to define new terms that are used in Section number 3, and it also creates a new section. Subsection E defines child abuse Medical Resource Center. Subsection F defines child abuse review and evaluation exam, which would be referred to as CARE. Subsection G would define child abuse review and evaluation network. Subsection H defines child abuse review and evaluation provider. And subsection E defines child abuse review and evaluation referral. A CARE referral means a brief written review of allegations of physical abuse, emotional abuse, medical neglect, or physical neglect submitted by the secretary or a law enforcement agency for recommendation of such child's need for medical care that may include one of these CARE exams. And a CARE exam would mean a forensic medical evaluation of a child that is alleged to be a victim of abuse or neglect that is conducted by a CARE provider. And a care provider is a person licensed to practice medicine and surgery, commonly referred to as a physician, an APRN, or a licensed physician assistant who performs such exams and provides a medical diagnosis and treatment of a child alleged to be a victim of abuse or neglect, and that also receives specific and continuous trainings on child maltreatment, peer review, and mentoring. Section 3 amends KSA 3822-26. And this statute requires a visual observation in an investigation of child abuse. It adds a subsection for child abuse review and evaluation referrals in an investigation of child abuse. Subsection I-1 requires that upon assignment by the secretary of any investigation of physical abuse or neglect of a child who's 5 years or older, the secretary or law enforcement agency shall make one of these CARE referrals. The House Committee of the Whole added language that would also allow an investigation by law enforcement to trigger such mandatory CARE referral. And Section 1 is a new section of law, and it provides that when one of those CARE referrals is made under KSA 3822-26 to a child abuse medical resource center, that the center has recommended a CARE exam be conducted, and during the exam, a CARE provider determines that the child has been subjected to the abuse, that shall be reported in a completed review and given to the secretary as well as local law enforcement. And after the completion of the review, the secretary shall include the report in such case record. The completed case review would be required to be confidential, and the new section also outlines opportunities for collaborations for the provision of forensic evaluation services to a child who is the subject of a CARE referral or CARE exam. The Secretary of Health and Environment would be required to implement and administer training for this program, and the Secretary shall pay charges for the exam, but only for the reasonable cost of the exam. And you may remember a bill similar to this last year, Senate Bill 460, I believe, and this is very similar, but one of the changes is that the provider would be required to submit all charges for payment of reviews and CARE exams to the Secretary of Health and Environment within 90 days after the review or exam has been performed. And the other, an additional new part of this bill would be that the secretary shall pay all charges directly to the provider within 30 days of being submitted. Additionally, this bill would provide for a child abuse review and evaluation fund administered by the Secretary of Health and Environment that would pay for the exams, training of providers, and provision of those evaluation services. The secretary would be required to manage a database for the referrals and could adopt rules and regulations to implement the section, and the new section of law would be part of the Child in Need of Care Code, and it would be, the bill would go into effect is upon publication in the statute book, so July 1st. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Excellent, Jenna. Thank you. Any questions for Jenna? Seeing none, thank you. And we will move to our first proponent testimony, Ed Klump, Legislative Liaison.
Thank you, Madam Chair, committee members. Surprised I'm first, but I'll be glad to talk about our part of this. I think there's others that can talk about more details of how it works. My name is Ed Klump, and I'm here representing the Kansas Sheriff's Association, the Kansas Association of Chiefs of Police, and the Kansas Peace Officers Association. We fully support this bill. You know, these abuse and neglect cases have to be investigated from all angles. It's very important that we get accurate facts to present to prosecutors and ultimately to the trier of fact, the jury or a judge in a trial, and be accurate in those findings. And it's very important for numerous reasons. It minimizes doing this is going to minimize the chances of an injustice to a victim or victim's family if a case of abuse or neglect would happen to be misclassified as resulting from some innocent event. And likewise, the damage can occur to the family, including the child, if it's improperly classified as abuse or neglect when it is not. We have just as big an obligation to those accused as we do to the victims to get to the facts, find all the facts, and make sure we're accurate in what we're presenting. And this is an area of law that's sometimes challenging to look at the injuries that are indications of abuse or neglect in a child and make that determination. And so we welcome this additional resource to do that and assist us in making the right conclusions. Those two factors by themselves is a good reason to pass this bill right there, because it's important for victims and it's important for the accused as well. We appreciate the fact that the funding is addressed in this. Last year we testified on the bill. We voiced reservations about who was going to have to pay for that. This could be a pretty substantial financial burden especially on small counties. We have some very small counties in the state with some of them fewer than 2,000 people, and their budgets are often difficult when we add expenses like this. So we welcome that. I want to address that amendment that was made by the Committee of the Whole in the House on page 10, line 23. That amendment was made at our request, and I think that kind of speaks to how important we think this is. The way it was worded, it was clear that that triggered when DCF would assign an investigation, but many of these investigations come to us first. They're not assigned by DCF, and we wanted to be sure and be clear that when we initiate that investigation, DCF has not had it yet, that we still are clearly obligated to do everything that is designed in this bill for those 5 and under, and also the option of using that tool for those children above 5. So with that, Madam Chair, I'll answer questions.
Any questions for Ed? Yes.
Thanks, Ed, for being here. And so back to your amendment that was offered. So that was just clarifying that a DOC, that it's starting there, that it's starting with the Department of Corrections, or with DOC. I was looking at there's required DOC or law enforcement to make the referral to DCF, so that sometimes we'll hear that DCF hasn't followed through, but this is clarifying that it has to come from you.
So it's actual dual. Both, they're supposed to be reported to both. And there's other statutes that we have an obligation, if the complaint comes to us first, we have to report that to DCF. through their hotline like anybody else would have to. And so the issue that we had here in this specific paragraph where we added that, it said that if DCF assigns the investigation, then those tools were available and had to be used. And we wanted to make it clear that even if DCF doesn't assign it, if we are investigating, if we initiate an investigation, we want to have that tool available to us as well. That was important for us to get to where we need to be on the investigation, but it also was important from the standpoint of just fairness. Victims shouldn't be treated differently just because of who's initiating the investigation. So we just wanted to make it crystal clear that we had the same responsibilities as DCF when it came to these investigations.
And Madam Chair, just as a follow-up, didn't we deal with this very issue, I don't know, it was last year or the year before, in another piece of legislation?
Well, we had a piece of legislation 2 years ago, I think it was, dealing with the exchange of information between law enforcement and DCF. And we were having difficulties with some information not being shared with law enforcement that was very critical to our investigations. That bill passed, and I'm happy to report that that has been a great, great aid to that exchange of information between law enforcement and DCF.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Petty. Senator Stephan.
Thank you. Help me understand how this works. Again, your concern is accuracy of diagnosis, which would lead one to infer that you don't believe there's currently accuracy of diagnosis in abuse cases?
Well, I think there probably is in most cases, but I think this is a good tool that directs us to get that analysis from a physician who has specifically been trained in abuse or neglect. The way I understand it, we're kind of getting into the area that's not the law enforcement realm of this bill, but that's my understanding of what this does.
Well, I would put forth that you're putting a whole lot of faith in that big leap, that you're going to increase your accuracy when you create quite this imbalance away from the physicians who've taken care of that child possibly, or are in that community. Where are we going to move these kids to be evaluated?
You know, those are questions for other proponents to talk about. That's not what our role is in this, and I think they can best explain that.
I think your understanding of that would be critical before you could be a proponent, isn't it?
You know, no process is 100% perfect, and I don't see anything in this bill that rules out dependence on a physician who has treated that child in the past and is familiar with that child. This is just an additional tool, the way we see it, of getting it in the hands of a person, a physician, who is trained on specifically abuse and neglect injuries and indicators. And that seems to us like to be a good process to have to supplement what goes on today.
Seems, but you don't know, correct?
Well, I don't think we ever know anything until we put something in place and see how it works.
Yeah, I don't know that I agree with that, but thank you.
Senator Baumgardner.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being here today, Ed. Last fiscal year, we had more than 2,000 kids put into placement for abuse and neglect. So what percentage of those do you think went through law enforcement first? Do you know what that contact ratio is?
I do not have that data. I wouldn't want to speculate on it. I know, you know, after hours, especially if there's a serious injury or a child shows up in an emergency room, something like that, we almost always get the call first and respond.
But
there are a lot that are reported through DCF through the call center, and then those are oftentimes referred to us by DCF, but I don't know what that ratio is.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Are there other questions for Ed? Seeing none, thank you so much. And next we will have Emily Keeloff and Dr. Jennifer Hansen, both physicians at Kansas Chapter AA of Pediatrics through WebEx. Are they on there, Dusty? Great.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay. Well, Chair Senator Gossage and members of the committee, thank you so much for having us today. As you said, I'm Emily Killow. I'm a child abuse pediatrician in the Kansas City area and here representing the Kansas chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Dr. Hansen's also on WebEx today, and we are sorry that we can't be there in person. I'm out of state at a conference, actually training some other medical providers, and so that's where I am, and Dr. Hansen had to be in court today, so we apologize we can't be there, but we are here to share our support for House Bill 2034, which helps create the CARE network. Kansas Academy, American Academy of Pediatrics, KDHE, and DCF have been collaborating on the coordination of the CARE program since July 22, and we can report some of the progress that has been made to you today. We are grateful for the 2022 legislature enacting a proviso, which has helped provide a foundation for the creation of this network, which was a great first step in establishing the CARE network. But we do believe that having a permanent law is really key in helping our network reach its full potential. And so this bill would help sustain our progress. I think one of the questions that came up to Mr. Klump was about trained providers across the state, and we are happy to report that we did do an initial training at the end of September in 2022, and I think you have the map in our testimony, but there's now 28 trained care providers really across the state in 14 different Kansas communities, and the goal is really to help children get medical care in the communities where they live. So they're not having to travel to Kansas City or Wichita for that medical evaluation, and to give those medical providers in their communities additional training and support. Many of them are already seeing these children. So it's not necessarily changing who they're seeing, but it's just providing additional training and support to help enable them to do these evaluations when there are concerns for child abuse or neglect. And so we think that increasing the number of medical providers across the state with this expertise and support will just really improve the quality medical care that these children are receiving and decrease burdens on families and investigators. We've also been working with KDHE to create a statewide referral system using the IRIS database, which was also being used, was already in use in the state of Kansas. And this will manage the chain of information between providers and agencies in a secure and efficient manner. It is compliant with all HIPAA laws and regulations as well. And so this will allow those written referrals from DCF or law enforcement to be sent to the Care Resource Center, which will then allow us to provide that recommendation regarding the need for medical care, and then help provide the referrals to those local care providers for that care. And then the last piece is working on the payment system for reimbursement of the care exams with KDHE, and we are working through that process as well. So we've made a good amount of progress since last July, and we are really encouraged by having this bill move through to you, and I am happy to answer any additional questions. And Jen Hansen, if you have anything you wanted to add, feel free.
Dusty, is Jennifer on? Okay, Jennifer, if you
She may
could.
be just able to listen.
Anything to add.
Okay.
Okay. I think she said I have nothing more to add. Is that correct? All right, committee, do we have any questions for either Emily or Jennifer? Senator Thompson.
Thank you. For either one, I guess I'm trying to understand. I think we heard this similar concept as Senator Petty mentioned a couple years ago. This care network. If doctors could opt in to train on their own, why would we need to establish this network and put in all this bureaucratic type structure for payment and things of that nature when it could be easily accomplished if doctors who wanted to get the training could just do it? The option was there. And then you don't have to set up a network. You've got all the physicians around the state who are already interested in providing this kind of service. Just curious about that. Thank you.
So this specific training wasn't available before the proviso measure, and the type of training I did, so I did 3 additional years of fellowship after my pediatric residency, and I would say there are a lot of people who are, primary care providers for children who may have been abused or maltreated, but don't have the time or ability to do a 3-year fellowship, and so really it's aligning. General practitioners in their communities to get some additional training in the evaluation of kids who may have been abused and neglected, and then also have ongoing training opportunities, mentorship, and support with the creation of this network. And those things truly are not available without this.
So is this 3-year fellowship part of the training?
No, but the people in charge of the training have all gone through that fellowship process, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
All righty. Thank you. Thank you,
Yeah,
Madam
you're
Chair.
welcome.
Committee, other questions? Yes, Senator Steffen.
Thank you. Again, and I do think we hashed this out in the past, like Senator Thompson mentioned, but again, I'm very concerned. You clearly have had the opportunity to train physicians across the state, which is exactly what you need to do. And there's certainly the opportunity to work with residencies to make this a standard part of training. But I too am confused as to why we're seeing this as a bill. Now, I see the money involved. I see the increase in staff in government. I see KDHE becoming the all-knowing arbiter of abuse evaluation knowledge, and that's all very problematic for me. Also, your representation from the American Academy of Pediatrics, that's the same entity that very recently came out in support of transgender surgery on minors with horrible data supporting that, and now backing away from it. I think you have every opportunity in the world to network with the doctors around the state who take care of these kids already or who provide these services in the community. Is this not a bit of a great marketing opportunity for your specialty to ensure access to patients and payment as well? There seems to be a disconnect here somewhere. Why do we? It sounds like you're making progress. Why do we need this bill? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I appreciate it. So I think the progress that we've made without the bill would essentially halt, and the program wouldn't continue without additional ongoing funding, just because for the referral system from DCF to the medical resource centers to continue, we would need this bill to establish that system, and DCF really needs this in statute in order to make those referrals on a consistent basis. And so I think that piece is huge, just improving the communication between DCF and the medical community to provide those referrals, to provide that immediate recommendation back to DCF regarding the need for a medical evaluation or not, and then to provide that ongoing support to medical providers in their own communities, because clearly we can't impart the knowledge from a 3-year fellowship to people in a 2-day training. And so the key is really that ongoing education, that ongoing mentorship, and support for medical providers as they do these evaluations.
If I may, this is Dr. Hansen. I would just add to what Dr. Killo said. The child welfare system and the evaluation and investigation of child maltreatment concerns is really a multidisciplinary process. So the medical piece of it is just one piece of this puzzle that all has to fit together. And so, yes, we could continue to provide mentorship and training to medical providers across the state, but without statutory support to ensure that this is happening regularly for our most at-risk kids, to make sure that DCF, number one, has the procedural and statutory support to do this within their everyday actions, the funding to support the system, the ability to connect across from medical to KDHE to law enforcement to DCF and freely share information. All of this is part of this care network that really is needed to ensure best outcomes for kids.
Quick follow-up, thank you. Do you have evidence that kids aren't getting evaluated now
Yes, so I think GCF would be able to best answer that question, but I don't have current numbers. I apologize, my voice is a little bit scratchy. I don't have numbers, but we know that from just in our kind of initial pilot program that we are certainly seeing children for medical evaluations that we wouldn't have known about before or that wouldn't have gotten medical evaluations. So I do think we are improving access to medical care thus far.
Senator Petty.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and both the doctors, thank you for being here today. As I'm listening to this and as I recall back from the past and I looked at that map, it seems to me that one of the things that this, at the proviso, as you mentioned before, and now the legislation, was to make sure that we had a system in place so that medical providers had the best and most current access to support and training so that they could provide for these alleged abused children in the best possible way. And it seems to me that we should all be looking for how we can reduce the trauma that's involved, that they've already experienced, but that could also be involved as they go through the medical and the review. So it seems to me to be a very important support tool to have in place, and it also is helping for us to have across the state these primary care providers to have that expertise that you're providing support for. So thank you.
Senator Baumgartner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I know that Senator Thompson as well as Senator Stephan brought up, why are we hearing this? Didn't we hear this before? We did hear this before, and we passed it out, and we voted on it. But it got stalled on the House, and that's how it ended up being a proviso. I do think it's important for it to be said that one of the concerns that everyone on this committee had, and I shared that concern, and it was with KDHE saying, I think, as memory serves me, they thought they needed like 2.5 FTEs to schedule the training sessions and to coordinate, and we all felt that was egregious. And so with the proviso, they've been able to do that without the 2.5 FTEs. So they've demonstrated the ability to move this forward in our state. So essentially, we have a one-year pilot program because that's what a proviso is. It's a one-year temporary pilot. So why is it here before us today? It's so that it's not temporary. And I want to remind the committee, and we have at least one new member of the committee this year, but part of the testimony that we heard last year was the concern where a physician that didn't have the proper training said, yes, this child, victim of child abuse. And then when the child was examined by a physician with the proper training, that child was reunited with parents as that child should have been. Likewise, there was an infant that was taken into the emergency room, and it was identified that no, not child abuse. But then when it was pursued for an exam with someone that had a physician that had the proper training, the x-ray was for the leg, but what they also found with the physician with the proper training was there was a skull fracture that was truly an indication of child abuse, though the ER doctor and law enforcement that had been called in said, no, not child abuse. And that child went back into that abusive home until there was that follow-up exam. So why is this important? Because when a child isn't a victim of child abuse, because one thing we know to be true today in healthcare in Kansas, fewer and fewer families have a family physician. Fewer and fewer doctors consistently on an annual basis see small children and can testify to the householder what's traditional for the health of that child. And do I like that we have to have folks that have this special training? No, I don't. Do I like the fact that we've had more than 2,000 kids just last year put into foster care because of neglect and abuse. I don't like that either, but I sure don't want a child who has not been abused, who just literally fell off the bicycle, or in the case of my daughter, was running to beat another child to the swing set on the playground and fell and broke her arm. It wasn't abuse. It was she wanted to get there first and she tripped. And so we don't want children that haven't been abused taken away from families, and we want those that are at risk of maltreatment to make sure that they get the appropriate protections. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I have a couple of questions. One, I'm seeing in the fiscal note that it is requesting 2 additional FTE positions. Is that right?
I believe KDHE, Mallory, are you there? Is someone else? I don't have the fiscal note in front of me. I apologize.
I can read the sentence to you.
Okay, thank you.
Estimates current program expenditures, $757,000 in 2023, $758,000 in fiscal year 2024, all from the state general fund, which is fully funded in the governor's recommended budget. Enactment of this would not generate additional expenditures in either fiscal year, but would require the addition of 2 FTE positions. Maybe I would need KDHE to respond to that. I'm a very logistical person, so could you take me back? Just where does the emphasis of this begin? So if we had the etymology, we start with a child is abused. Maybe parents take them to the doctor or an urgent care or something. At what point do you guys get involved?
Sure, that's a great question. I'll walk you through an example. And so the bill really focuses on young children, so children 5 and under, which we know are at the highest risk for morbidity and mortality from abuse and neglect. So that's kind of the goal of focusing on that. So we'll use an example of an infant who's taken to daycare. Daycare notices that there is bruising to the infant's face and to their torso. The daycare makes a report to DCF. DCF gets that report, would go make contact with the family, and could send a written referral through the IRIS system to a child abuse pediatrician or one of the resource centers, and would say, they don't, obviously who makes the report is confidential, so I'm just using this as an example, but DCF received a report about a 5-month-old baby who has bruising to the face and the torso. There's no known history of accidental trauma, or, there's no one knows how these bruises occurred. And then we would receive that report. We would send back, this child needs a medical evaluation. And so that's sort of the initial process. And then depending on where that child lives, we would help identify the appropriate medical provider for DCF to take that child to. So that would be part of our recommendation back to them. Then that child would be seen by a care provider or a medical provider who has the information from their training about the evidence-based recommendations for a 5-month-old with bruising to their face and their torso, which would include head imaging and a skeletal survey and additional labs to make sure they don't have a bleeding disorder or another medical, cause for that bruising. And so then that medical evaluation would occur, and then that medical information of, those diagnostic evaluations would then be given back to DCF and law enforcement.
So then if that person was sent, if the complaint from the caregiver or the daycare person was, sometimes they don't know to contact DCF, they might contact the police.
Correct.
And so then is that where we hear that law enforcement would get involved?
Yes.
And they would contact DCF, I'm assuming, and maybe come out and follow up with talking to the parents and do an investigation. So my question is, how is that different before the Care Network was created?
So currently in the state, sometimes a child will be sent to, for example, no medical care. So that baby with bruises, sometimes DCF may receive an explanation from a family or a caregiver and say, okay, this seems okay, and may not be aware that that child, medically, the evidence would recommend that child needs a head CT and a skeletal survey. That's necessarily in a DCF social worker's, expertise to know that those things are recommended or what labs are recommended when there is an infant with bruising. So currently, that child may not receive medical care. And if they do receive medical care, frequently it's at local ERs, where again, local emergency room physicians have a wide array of sort of different knowledge, training, and expertise when it comes to child maltreatment. And I think Senator Baumgartner's example that she provided a bit ago is that they don't always get the evidence-based recommended, medical evaluation where we do additional x-rays and head imaging and labs for infants with bruising. And that is frequently not done in many like local emergency rooms across the state. And so that's why we feel it's so important to get that more people with this knowledge, expertise, and training so that children are getting these evidence-based evaluations done when they're indicated so that we get the best information. We identify additional injuries if they're present, because that helps us get to the best sort of answer for that child, or the best diagnosis.
Thank you. And one last question that I have, and this probably needs to come from DCF. I have a request from DCF to know how many cases were referred to you and the CARE network since the CARE network was started. And I believe that was in July of last year. Is that correct?
Yes. So currently the pilot is only piloting this in 5 counties in the Kansas City area. And so I have the numbers. Let me just pull them up here quickly. Okay, so in our pilot, we received 100, just from July to December 2022 in these 5 counties. And we received 197 referrals involving 241 children. That was only about half of the eligible cases when we looked back at DCF data. So again, we think that putting this in statute would then make this, required for DCF. And we would hope that we would then be seeing 100% of the cases through referrals rather than about half. The vast majority were under the age of 6. We do have the option to have referrals for older children, and we did receive a few referrals for that. About 76%, we said they didn't need a medical evaluation based on the information provided to us from DCF. And 17% or 42 children, we recommended an evaluation by a care provider. 5% we said should have an evaluation with their primary care provider, whether they were a care provider or not. And those were for things like poor weight gain or, need for follow-up for medical problems. So that's kind of a brief overview of those few months from our pilot program in that 5-county area.
Thank you very much. And Senator Thompson, you had a question?
Yeah, since we've had this pilot program, do we have actual stats that we could look at from this last year and try to compare? I guess I'm trying to wrap my head around how we can tell whether or not this is making a difference, whether we're actually catching these kids, what the filtering process is, estimates on that sort of thing, I think would be very helpful.
I agree, and that's why I was asking DCF if we have a representative here from DCF today. I think we do. If they could get that data to us. Anytime you have a pilot program, you always want to evaluate how successful the program was, how many people they helped, and just know more about that. I agree.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Stephan.
Thank you. Just quick request. Again, if the goal is more accurate diagnoses, and we have a fellowship that's 3 years long and obviously has some sort of track record, there should be data to back that claim up. And I'd like to see that, please. Thank you.
Committee, other questions? Seeing none, this closes the hearing on HB 2034, and committee, we are adjourned.